name's Leanne, and I'm on the Vancouver Startup Week team. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're grateful to be virtually gathered on Indigenous land, regardless of where you're joining us from. I'm grateful to be here on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us at VSW 2021 for today's first session. Today, and welcome to How to Tell Your Startup Story by Business in Vancouver. This session is part of the VSW Founder Track and is proudly supported by Sage Accounting. Sage knows that you didn't start up your business to become an accountant. Sorry to any of the accountants in our audience. Sage Accounting keeps your business organized and running smoothly. Track your cash flow, send your invoices, and get paid quickly. Visit the Sage Accounting booth to access free guides and templates for starting your business finances the right way. Plus, get an exclusive VSW discount if you're ready to switch from Excel. With that, during today's session, if you have any questions for our speakers, please post them in the Q&A on the Whova chat platform, and you can upvote your questions and we'll ask them during the Q&A portion. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to our moderator, Haley, and we'll begin.
Thanks so much, Leanne. Good morning to everyone joining us on Zoom and on Whova. Great to see you here. And please do, as Leanne mentioned, share your questions via the Whova platform. I'm keeping an eye on that. It looks like we already have some in there, so that's great. You can vote up the ones that you'd like us to ask. We'll try and sprinkle those throughout our conversation today. I'm Haley Wooden, Executive Editor at Business in Vancouver. For those who don't know, we publish a weekly newspaper, more than a dozen magazines, a daily business podcast, and we have a new podcast that focuses on equity, diversity, and inclusion in BC business. Anyone familiar with BIV knows that coverage of BC's technology sector and the startup scene is a big focus for us. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Now, we've assembled a great team of panelists who each offer a unique perspective on earning media coverage. I'll introduce them in a moment, but we have a founder who has gone from startup to IPO. We have a public relations expert who works with companies every day to help them tell their stories, an angel investor in VC who hears pitches all of the time, and you'll hear a little bit from me as well throughout our conversation, coming from a reporter and editor perspective from someone who hears media pitches every single day. Now, the goal today is to leave you with as much practical information as possible on how to get media coverage, what it means to earn media coverage, how to interact with reporters, and ultimately how to leverage media coverage opportunities. It's not just good enough to chase media coverage for the sake of it. It's really helpful to have a strategy in place. And as I mentioned, we'll try and get to as many of your questions as possible. So now for our panel, we are joined this morning by Maninder Dhaliwal, Chair of Thai Angels Vancouver and President and CEO of Lionsgate International. Thanks for joining us. We have Kathleen Reed, founder of Switchboard Public Relations, which is a diamond sponsor of Vancouver Startup Week. Great to have you, Kathleen. And we have Greg Smith, co-founder and CEO of Thinkific, which recently had its IPO and has been featured in lots of media outlets, including Business in Vancouver. Greg, glad you could join us.
Thank you.
Pleased that you are all willing to share your morning with us after the long weekend on this short week. I want to start with something I touched on a little bit, and that's why media coverage matters, or depending on your perspective, maybe why it doesn't. And I find at times there's a lot of pressure to just chase it for the sake of chasing it. It's a great clipping to have, but how can it be leveraged? So Kathleen, maybe I'll put you on the spot and throw to you first. From your perspective, how important should earning media coverage be for a startup?
Thanks, Haley. I'm happy to take the first stab at this one. I think when you're looking at media coverage, it really does depend if you have a story, and we can maybe get into what makes a story from an editor and a journalist perspective. But media receive hundreds of pitches in their inbox, and Haley, you can attest to this, and you can see it on Twitter, even with reporters saying like, my inbox is slammed, maybe DM me instead, things like that. I think where media can be really helpful is when you need validators, when you're first to market, when you have something and you need to help sway the public's opinion on something. So maybe you have a new product, there's you know, a new COVID treatment out there and you want to spread the word. But first, things that are unusual in your story, if you're wanting to have validation in the market, it can help you build your board, reach out to VCs, those kind of things. So it really depends. And there's no point in getting the clipping just for the clipping. You've got to have a strategy in place. So that would be my biggest takeaway, is have the strategy in place, and don't just pound reporters' inboxes trying to look for that coverage. Really make sure you've got a story.
Yeah, and being strategic, I would add to that in terms of who you reach out to, because media outlets are all different. Reporters have their own beats. It's important to know. That's a good jumping off point, Maninder. For your perspective as an investor, does it matter to you if startups you invest in have earned media coverage or not?
Well, it depends. It depends, is the media coverage. So I'm going to say, if you're looking for a pithy summary, I would say that media coverage is not a substitute for sales hustle. And founder brand is not a substitute for product market fit. So is the media coverage aligned with what you're trying to do? If you're a B2C product, you're trying to push a crowdfunding campaign, that makes total sense. But if as an angel investor, I see a slide deck with 6 media clippings in the appendix and not a single mention of a customer they've talked to, then it's red flag. So it is a good thing, provided it's aligned with what you're trying to do as a larger picture for your business.
For anyone who joined us a couple minutes early, you would have heard Maninder and Greg talking about product market fit. So Greg, I'll throw to you now for Thinkific. Was earning media coverage important in the early days?
We did earned media early days, but I had no clue about media coverage early days. So we really didn't get to, we got the occasional bit, but it was much more accidental and without a lot of strategy. But we did a lot of earned media, which was more, say, to word of mouth, reviews, customer testimonials, other people writing about us, but not so much. I had no clue on how to talk to the media or how to get in front of them or make that happen. So early days, it didn't play too much into our strategy until we got a little further along and people joined our marketing team who started seriously thinking about this in a way that I wasn't.
Interesting. Kathleen, maybe I'll throw to you on this. You can perhaps share with our audience the difference between earned media coverage, some of the other options that are out there that you might advise companies to take advantage of.
For sure. And I would echo Maninder and Greg's point just around use cases. So if you've got any and you've got people who can speak on your behalf, when a company is telling their own story, right, there's always a little bit of bias there. So if you've got users and other folks that can, you know, shout from the rooftops, that's great. So in terms of earned media, when we say earned media, what does that mean in plain language? You've sent out a pitch and you're not paying for that piece of media coverage. So a reporter, an editor, assignment editor, producer wants to tell that story, which is great. There's also what you would refer to as pay for play or sponsored content. So that's where you're putting money, so ad dollars behind content, and you might do that to help you know, boost coverage around something, advertise to certain folks. At Switchboard, we primarily use earned media first, always, to try to get the story out there. And then we look at using pay for play or sponsored content. And this is an important part of your strategy, so you definitely don't want to miss it. Early days, you know, the budget for something like that, it really depends on how much you've got to spend. So where does it make sense? Haley touched on this a little bit earlier, but, you know, where are your customers? What are they reading if it's a B2C play? So lots of things to think about.
And I think, at least from a reporting perspective, earned media coverage is kind of the holy grail, because it's something that other people found value in. They wanted to tell your story because it's a great story, not because you paid for someone to tell that story. Greg, you mentioned that that's kind of how it was early on. Beyond the startup phase and when you started investing in your marketing team and looking at media coverage, how easy, difficult, challenging was it to get media to notice you?
Yeah, I would say, so when we first started doing it, we were doing it very last minute. We would have an online event like, you know, Startup Week, except we'd be hosting it for entrepreneurs creating their own courses. And we would, a few weeks before or even a month before the event, just start mad rush, start pitching and trying to get coverage for it. And it was very selfish coverage. It was sort of, we have an event, will you cover this event in the way that you want us to? And we realized pretty quickly that we might get a little that way, but it was very little or nothing. And so it kind of turned to a few key realizations. One, we needed a bit more of a serious strategy. Two, we needed to start thinking about this much more like content where it was a long-term play, and the work you were doing today might benefit you at the end of the year or even next year or beyond. It was about building relationships. And then partly for us, at least, that came to realizing we needed to work with a third-party consultant who really knew this space, because no one internally was going to focus on it. They were just going to pick it up whenever we needed it. And if you wait until the moment you need it, it's probably not there for you.
I would say, like, we always explain media relations to startups or folks that are learning about it for the first time. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So you're not going to get it overnight. You're playing a little bit of the long game with media relations, and it's really driven by relationships. You want to have them in the good times, right? But also in bad times. So if you had an issue that you were trying to manage, you can call upon some of those relationships. So
100% well said. And I know, speaking from experience and for other reporters in our newsroom, if there's a bad instance, you get a fact that's incorrect, or you show up to an event and the event was canceled, that can burn a relationship that could have been useful over a long period of time. Maninder, I want to turn to you now from an investor perspective. Should startups always be telling their story and talking about everything they're doing, at the risk of maybe sharing with competitors what they're doing, or sharing with other people some of the secrets that's going on?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and it depends upon the situation. And my specialty is science-based deep tech and B2B software. And in our market, we always think there's always going to be multiple players in your market. So if you have no competition, that basically means you have no business. That's what I tell the founders that I work with. So competition is good, but have a strategy. You know, as we do the slide deck, there's a public slides, there's NDA, and then there's secret sauce. So secret sauce, you do not share. NDA, you share after you know that they're in the inner circle, and then there's public. So you need to have a strategy, but does it make sense to stay in stealth mode for some time? Yes, it does. It depends upon the startup. So you need to really take a look at what are you building, who's the competition, and how quickly can someone move in your space and build a business faster than you? So I'm going to say the answer is it depends.
I think Greg said it well when you said that reporters weren't necessarily wanting to cover an event that you wanted them to cover in the way in which you wanted them to cover it. Kathleen, what would you say are some of the myths or assumptions associated with earned media coverage?
I think what we see a lot is startups will come to us and they want to be in the Washington Post, or they want to be on TechCrunch from day one. And I mean, Greg touched upon this, and it's great that someone who's gone through it can speak to it from the business side. But you're playing a long-term game, and you need to see validation. And sometimes that's in your own backyard, so in Vancouver or in the province as a whole, or nationally in Canada. And I know a lot of companies in Canada don't want the Canadian coverage. They'll come to us and they just want the US coverage, and that makes sense too. But sometimes you need that validation here first, at least to show that you can get, journalists are going to look, oh, have they had it in their own? And I think just the speed at which it happens, it's sometimes, and we're seeing this more and more, I think there's a lot of reasons for it. Just some of the fatigue that reporters are feeling, Haley, with COVID and the amount of pitches that they've seen coming into their inboxes, that you're having to do a few more touch points now. And you really do need to make sure you've got a story before you're pitching. There's no point in pitching for the sake of pitching. You're going to use hours out of the client's retainer or budget, or you're going to use your own hours. And when you're at the startup stage, it's a grind and you're doing a ton of things every day. If you're just pitching to pitch, that doesn't work. Everyone has seen that big mass blind copy, or Haley, when we were chatting a few years ago at Vancouver Startup Week with Farhan, where they don't have the person's name correct in the title. Like, there's all these little things that make a difference. So I would encourage less pitching, but more, more focused pitching. So think about who you're pitching, look through their Twitter feed, look at what they're commenting, look at what their last stories have been, and then pitch that way if you're doing it yourself.
Yeah, I've been called Henry. I've been called even names without an H. I think someone sent me a pitch. Hi, Frank. How are you? It's pretty clear. I don't know what happened. It was a copy paste, or they genuinely meant to send it to the wrong person. But from the get-go, I'm looking at that saying, okay, do you know who I am? Is this even intended for me? We have a good question from our audience, and I want to ask it now before we get too far along, and that's, how do you define storytelling when it concerns a business? So maybe, I think this is something everyone can comment on, but Greg, maybe you can share how Thinkific has thought about and rethought and reworked your story and how you communicate that to media.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think early on, we were thinking about tell the story of the thing we have coming up next week. So, and that's not great, partly because it's very selfish. It's very much about us right now. It's the thing we want. It's not what the medium necessarily cares about. So the two things that I think have worked for us, one is obviously thinking about and trying to be helpful to reporters and what they're looking to cover, and just being as helpful as possible and being available. But then from a strict storytelling, and that might mean telling some of this, being very open to telling the stories they want to tell, and inserting yourself into the stories that they're already thinking about telling. And then the other piece is less telling of our story and much more telling of our customers' stories. And I think we talked about this a little bit before, but having a whole bunch of great customer stories in your back pocket, and even if you only have 3 customers, knowing each of their stories really, really well and working them in can often be a lot more compelling than telling the story of another startup starting up. So that was a big one for us, is telling the customer story and the benefits it had to them, the way it changed their life, the emotions involved, as opposed to the hard pitch of use our product or something.
And that's a win-win, of course. I mean, your customer in theory is happy. You get to get your story out there, and the reporter in theory is happy too because they have a great story.
Yeah.
Maninder, from your perspective, storytelling when it comes to a business, what do you think?
Well, I think it's huge. It matters. It makes a difference whether you get funded or not. And for me, storytelling, I would take a step back from saying, if you're a startup that doesn't have customers yet, storytelling for you is how you fit into the zeitgeist, how you will solve problems, and for who. And that is something that is the first thing you do when you start raising money, is we need to know that. And when you have customers, their stories as user-generated content and user-generated events and having evangelists and communities, that matters a lot. But if you don't have customers yet, you need to know how you're serving, how you're making the world a better place. And this is, everything from Oatly to Facebook to Allbirds, they all are making the world a better place. And there's a reason those wording is used, because it helps you raise money, get the first customers. So yes, I think storytelling can make a difference between a startup making it or not. Good storytelling is that big.
And maybe I'll qualify the question when I put it to you, Kathleen. How do you tell a good story? Because you can tell a story, but it's not necessarily a good one or a compelling narrative.
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. One, and I know Vancouver Startup Week isn't just tech companies, but I would caution everyone to look at jargon. So making sure that you're not using too much technical jargon, that you're using plain language, particularly if you're pitching mainstream media. So if you were pitching Haley at Business in Vancouver, she's used to trade terms. She's a business trade publication. She knows terms like that. But if you were pitching someone at Global News, for example, you want to remove a lot of that jargon. So that's number one, really use that plain language. And there's great books on this, like Play Bigger has a whole section about using plain language, right? We touched on this a little bit, but use cases are huge. You want to show, not tell, right? Because as the company, there's always a bit of bias when you're telling. So you want to show, and use cases are a great way to do that. And then I think being authentic and unique and adding, personal sentiments into your storytelling really goes a long way, particularly right now in what we're seeing. So anything that you can add that sprinkles in a little bit of the personal is great. And then from the startup perspective, your why is so powerful, right? It's the purpose. It's the reason you get out of bed every day. It's the reason you're working the 10, 12, 13-hour days that you're working. So sprinkle in your why and make sure you know that why. There's great resources. Again, Start With Why is a good book you could read. But I think the why when you're pitching, if you're looking to raise capital or if you're recruiting talent to join your startup, that's really important in your storytelling. So those would be a few of my takeaways.
Knowing your audience is certainly huge. And I would say knowing the medium too. Writing a short what's happening kind of story online is very different than something that might be in a magazine where it's written weeks, if not months in advance. And I would encourage anyone, if you want to get into a specific publication, read what they're putting out. A lot of stories start with, so-and-so had a problem, they couldn't find a solution, so they created one. It's a compelling narrative about something that a person is doing, not just about what's happening, which kind of brings me to advice. I'd like to hear advice from each of you. And Greg, maybe starting with you, can you offer any advice to a startup or a founder that's just getting going, that doesn't have a media strategy in place, but knows that they want to start earning some media coverage?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've already covered lots of little pieces of it here. On the advice side, if you're just getting going, I usually say pick 1 or 2 channels or marketing strategies that you're going to really be good at. Don't try and do everything. So we see, especially because we have a lot of people creating courses and then trying to market those courses, occasionally they get overwhelmed with 100 ways to market and start doing a little bit of 20 different ways. And so if this is going to be one of them, then I would invest heavily in for the long term in it. And it can pay off massively in the long term, right? It's not like advertising where you just have to constantly throw money at it and what's working one week can fail the next. You're going to have ups and downs and failures, but you do start to, there's a reason it's called earned. You've earned it. You don't own it, but you've earned it. Now it's there and it'll funnel in. So the biggest one is pick 1 or 2 things that you're going to be good at. And if this is going to be it, then recognize you're making a longer term, be consistent at it, develop those relationships. I think the relationship piece is key too. If you're just getting started, there's a good resource. I think it's Chris Winfield has it on identifying your 20 most influential people in your network and then connecting from there. So that's a good starting point to start making connections in this way. And then just continuously invest in it for the long haul as opposed to dabbling. If you send 50 emails to reporters tomorrow and then you kind of hope that something happens from that and you pick this up again in another couple of months when it's top of mind or you have a new thing coming up, you're probably not going to make much progress. So it's about making a choice that this is a big channel for you and investing and recognizing it's for the long haul.
And you mentioned a bit earlier, Greg, that shift from putting your story onto the reporter versus trying to fit your story maybe into a theme or a narrative that they're already working on. Did you manage to do that through hiring experts? Did you do your research? Did you just ask reporters? How did you kind of navigate that?
I think part of it was definitely getting outside help and getting advice and doing a bit more research on what worked. And then part of it is watching and following and being responsive. And so what I found works well is if you pick a few people who you want to work with, publications or reporters specifically, I find is good because you're not dealing with a publication, you're dealing with a person and they tend to write in a certain way or have certain topics. And so learning what they're writing about, understanding the way that they approach things, the kind of things they take and don't take. I mean, we had a reporter come by our office and spend 3 hours with us and look at all sorts of ideas and stuff. And as they walked out the door, said, call me when you raise money because that's all I cover. And so I just hadn't done my research. And so I didn't understand that. And they were walking in expecting that I knew that. And so I must be here to disclose privately, we're going to raise a bunch. So I think really understanding them. And then the key thing, and I've dropped the ball so many times on this, I don't even want to think about it, but being responsive is there's people I've engaged with on LinkedIn, and then I see that they write a big article right in our sweet spot a few months later. And I'm like, oh no. And I go to LinkedIn to follow up with them. And I saw that they wrote me back and said, hey, we're thinking about writing something. And I didn't respond because I wasn't watching that inbox. So I think developing a few better relationships where you watch them more closely is probably better than just spamming hundreds of journalists.
That's well said. And I can say from a reporter perspective too, sometimes you can't find people's emails that easily. And so a lot of reporters do use LinkedIn and you can easily miss a notification that comes in through LinkedIn if you're not watching it. Maninder, how about from you, advice you have for startups in terms of how they can get started?
Yes, I would say take a look at the bigger picture. So earned media is one thing and paid media is one thing. And then there's user generated content. Then there is events. So I think a startup needs to be in charge of the bigger picture and earned media only needs to be a part of it. And if you are, I will take an example. I'm working with a science-based startup. He's produced an amazing energy storage device. But the audience for us is utilities, electric car companies. So the focus is in LinkedIn. We are doing constant posts about how our product works, who we are talking to. And as we get to the point where we need earned media coverage, there is all this content for a reporter or an editor to review, to understand who we are, where we've been, what we are doing. So I would say use earned media as content creation, and there should be other content creations methods that you should be using as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. B2B is obviously going to be very different than B2C when it comes to your marketing and media strategy. Kathleen, advice for pitching journalists and getting that conversation started?
I think a couple of things. One, you really want to know the journalist you're pitching. Greg touched on this and he did a great job there. You can put Google alerts. You can use softwares like Visual Ping to track a reporter's Twitter feed. So Google alerts and Visual Ping are really easy tools to use when you're at the startup level for monitoring and tracking. Look at what they're covering and try to tie into narratives that they have. If you look at Business in Vancouver as an example, you know that they've got certain magazines that they publish and they have an editorial schedule around that. So you could look at pitching around that editorial calendar is a good way to get your story in. What's happening in the news and what can you piggyback off of? I call it piggybacking, but some people call it newsjacking, right? So what can you leverage? So an example of this was with the Suez Canal crisis when that was happening, right? Supply chains were really impacted. So if you had something, a food production company and it had to do with supply chains, you could leverage that and say, hey, look, we're seeing these supply chain shortages. Or when we saw the potato example in COVID, remember when they were saying, eat potatoes, Canadians, you all need to go eat your French fries. If you were a company, you could leverage that, right? There's things when there's a headline that you see in the news that you can leverage. So I say watch for that. Really make sure you're pitching in a way that works. So you can nudge reporters a bit over email, but try to connect with them on social first and go from there and build that relationship. So Haley, I'm sure if someone just sends you 5 emails, you're kind of like, ooh, but if they take the time to connect with you on LinkedIn, on Twitter, follow what you're doing, that goes a long way. So a lot of the times you will meet a journalist online before you ever meet them in real life, particularly now with all the work from home.
Very, very true. I love a personal email. I like one that it's clear that they've done their research. Doesn't need to be a ton of research, but I will say to the point of sort of piggybacking or newsjacking, sometimes I'll get an email. I wrote a story on one topic like 3 years ago and it's somehow in a database and they say, oh, Haley, I know that you really cover Bitcoin and it's just not true. I wrote one tiny brief about it a long time ago. So, you know, if you're going to do the research, do the research.
And I'd say use the Twitter profiles for reporters. It's such a great tool, right? And you can even see most reporters will say, don't DM me. I don't cover startups. I only cover, Greg, for example, when you're raising. That's all I'm going to talk about is if you're raising capital. I don't cover anything under 5 million. You know, there's all these little things where it's right in their Twitter bio. So definitely read it.
Greg, do you remember your first significant piece of media coverage?
I don't know about the first. I'd say like the most significant stuff has been the recent around the IPO, and I think the first, yeah, we had little coverages here and there, but it was more like it was so small. It was a quote, and then we were using the interesting way we were using that was to use the logo of the publication on our landing page to add some brand or some clout to the fact that we had been covered in these areas, and that slowly built over time. And then the more significant stuff came more with fundraising and more recently as we've got more serious and built a strategy around it. But I'd say, you know, early days versus now, one big thing that's changed is early on, we kind of got lost we went from that selfish stage to be really, really helpful. And then we were part of stories, but with almost nothing in it for us. And that's fine. It's better than nothing. But I think one thing we've learned is to be really intentional about your 1 or 2 talking points that you actually try and work in, and don't be afraid to bring those up. You know, you can watch the politicians do it. They are absolutely exceptional, but they get asked question A and they're answering question X because that's the question they want to answer. And so not that you want to not answer A and be as bad as some of the politicians are, but having those 1 or 2 talking points and being really clear, this is the outcome I want, and bringing that back into it is something that we've gotten better now. Like with our IPO stuff, we had a whole strategy going in, like these are the kind of headlines we want to see. This is what we're working to. And a lot of even the entire IPO was built around the media coverage we wanted to get and how we were going to tell that story, and whether it was, you know, it was about branding and hiring and attracting partners. And so that's what we were building for on that coverage.
That's really interesting. Yeah, you certainly need to make sure you get your message across, because the reporter might be looking for something else and they might not ask the question you hope that they're going to answer. Kathleen, do you have any great examples of a media pitch that worked really well? And can you maybe walk us through why it worked well?
Sure. I think subject lines are really important. So Greg mentioned thinking of what your dream headlines are, what you want, what's your objective. So I often give people TOM. So, it's a little acronym: target, objective, messages. So you know your target, who you're talking to, what's your objective, what are you wanting out of this as a company, and then 3 key messages that you want to put in there. So if you follow that for your pitch note, that can be really helpful. I think bulleting things out, using bold where it matters, letting the media know if there is an exclusive opportunity here. Be proactive and let folks know in the media when the spokesperson is available. So for example, Greg is available at X time, put it in Pacific and put it in Eastern. If you're pitching, across Canada, for example, or across the US, give both times. Just make it simple. Make sure everything's there. If you've got a news release, include it in the email copy. So if they're clicking it on their phone, they're not having to open an attachment and then go read something or link out. You just want to streamline things. Think of it almost as if you're servicing a client when you're sending a pitch note to members of the media. Make it as easy as possible for them and make sure you've got the assets they're going to look for. So, a backgrounder, a media backgrounder is really helpful. It's kind of like your Coles note or your cheat sheet. So, when was Thinkific started? What are some key milestones that they've had? So when did they IPO? Things like that. So you've got it available are really, really helpful when you're looking to put together your pitch note.
I would almost say, Maninder, the pitch to a journalist is maybe akin to the pitch you would make, an elevator pitch to an investor, right? You include the very important things in there, you make it succinct, and it's to the point. Do you have an example of a company you've worked with or seen that has a really good story around how they got media coverage?
Yeah, I'm going to say yes. These are not Canadian examples, but yes, we had some. The way we've used media quite, I'm going to say, cleverly, and it was purely accident. After that, we took credit for it. But we were closing a round. It's a US business. We were closing a round, and the round was half closed, and we knew there were people sitting on the fence. So we closed a tranche, and then we sent out a press release. We didn't even matter who covered it because we were going to distribute it. We sent a press release that mentioned all the impressive people that were joining the cap table. There was a coverage in a small blog. We took that, sent it to the people who were sitting on the fence, and we closed the other half of the trench in 3 weeks after. So, and this was barely accident, but now we do it deliberately.
And as an investor, what do you want founders to communicate? If they have, a couple of minutes on the phone with a reporter, what do you want to make sure they're getting across?
What getting across is, like, that Greg mentioned, first you have to know what your selfish agenda is. Keep that in the front, and in the back part is how you're changing the world where you don't get anything. Try to aim more towards getting what you want, and then you may end up towards the back where you end up having a quote, which is better than nothing, not ideal. But have a plan of how you want to be covered, what you want to convey. Is this media coverage because you're trying to hire? So you want to come across as a company that is woke, that cares about the world because you're trying to attract young people who are aligned with that? Is this are you in an M&A conversation and you want to talk about how much your revenue is, who your big clients are, your profit margins are good? So like Kathleen said, TOM, what is the objective? And that's the first thing, is what are you trying to get? And I always recommend take that piece of media coverage, share it on your social, make sure you add a paragraph in explaining what this is, where you control 100% of what words go there.
We have a question here from our audience, from Alexander, with 3 votes. So everyone, please keep voting up questions and putting them in the chat on Whova. The question is, these days people document everything and the startup journey is no exception. People around me often say we should be doing more PR and making more announcements, but I prefer to wait until everything is perfect. I can see the danger in both saying too much too soon and also in not promoting yourself and letting little milestones pass by. How do we tell our story effectively? Interesting question about balance there. Who wants to take a stab at that one?
I would ask this gentleman, I think it's what business is it? Are you B2B? Are you B2C? And what stage you are? And that would matter. Because I think he's asking the right questions. The trick about balance is, if you have infinite amount of time and resources, you will do everything. But the choice he has to make is, what is a better use of the founder's time and the founding team's time and the money you have in the bank? And I think that is the question that needs to be asked.
Mm-hmm. I wonder too, Greg, and maybe you can share from Thinkific's perspective, but you don't necessarily need to contact a reporter with every tiny little milestone. You can maybe leverage other forms of communication or social media to mark the milestones along the way. Have you managed to find balance in that way?
Yeah, and to the maybe part of the question I think might be asked there is when do you wait and when are you ready to start telling? And this is something that I was a bit shy to do early on, and we saw some of our US competitors who were better at telling their story. They were more willing to sort of share numbers and stats even when they were really small, and I think that cost us. And so I would suggest getting over the idea that it needs to be perfect and getting the message out. Look, if it's really going to hurt you competitively, like you're in biotech and this is your secret sauce, don't be sharing that. But if it's a message that attracts customers or attracts the objective, then get out there and tell it, and don't wait for it to be perfect. Don't wait for it to be, because it never will be. I mean, there were points even leading up to the IPO where I was thinking like, well, are we big enough to be telling the story? Have we really achieved that point? And I'm sure lots of people look at us and think like, oh, wow, you've achieved lots of success, but we still see it as we're just getting started. And so there's still even some reticence of how much we share. And I think the more you can get over that and get the message out sooner rather than later, the more you actually will achieve your next set of milestones faster. So that's a big, maybe it's unfair to label it Canadian, but Canadian way of looking at it of like, oh, we're not big enough yet. It's not perfect yet. We can't get out and sell it. If it's going to get you customers, if it's going to get you that objective, then get out and tell the story.
I've heard that their Canadian companies tend to be a lot quieter in their marketing and a lot perhaps more humble is a word to use. Kathleen, you have experience working with companies on both sides of the border.
Yeah. I was going to say Canadians, we're very humble. It's funny when we're putting pitch notes together for US clients, they're like, oh, be punchier. Oh, we can have some controversy. They're okay with it. I would encourage Canadians to be a bit bolder. We've got so many amazing things happening here in BC and Canada as a whole. So be bold in your storytelling. I would just echo to Greg's point that you want to build those touch points with reporters. So while the milestone may feel small, let's say it's a 2 million raise and it feels small for you, that's a great touch point. And hey, we're looking to do bigger and better things in the future. We want to keep you updated. Do you mind if I keep sending you updates on my journey? You can build those relationships and let people know what's coming for you. So while it might not equal coverage, that's a great way to keep the relationship there and let reporters know, hey, in case you missed this, this is what's going on. So I would encourage to use those small milestones as a touch point, and maybe don't think of it as earned coverage, particularly, depending on what's happening in that day in the news. If some companies IPO'd or there's another, $10 million raise, those stories are definitely going to carry weight. But if it was a slow day for news, maybe that story gets you a headline. So you never know.
And it might not be a milestone that earns coverage in and of itself, but it might fit with other milestones that have been announced and maybe a reporter sees a trend ongoing. I know we recently in BIV wrote a story about unicorns in BC and a number of impressive IPOs and raises, and that became sort of a picture of what's happening in BC's tech scene. It does raise a good point about risk though. So Kathleen, I want to ask you about what are maybe some of the risks in speaking to media and things that founders and entrepreneurs should be aware of when doing so.
I think every time someone's speaking to the media, there are a few things you need to keep in mind. And everyone's had kind of moments where they're like, oh, I can't believe I said that. So one is that you're always on the record. So keep that in mind. The member of the media is often recording you and they'll note that. I often tell my clients to record their conversations as well so that they have their own record of it. The other thing I like to tell clients, if you don't know, you can say you don't know. Like Haley's not going to say, oh my God, you don't know the answer. You can say, hey, I don't know. I can get back to you. Can I follow up by 4 p.m. today? Or, hey, I don't have that stat handy. I think it's about this, but because you're probably going to quote me, I want to get the exact stat for you. So you can say that you don't know. Better to say you don't know than giving inaccurate information, right? Because that's going to burn the bridge, like Haley mentioned earlier. I would say when you're doing interviews, there's techniques that you can use. So I prefer for my clients right now, because we're not having cameras go into offices, to be doing face-to-face, because it's always harder for someone to be, a total asshole to you if you're face-to-face than if you're on the phone. But sometimes on the phone is a good way to do it because you can have someone pass information to you if you need to be fed information, those kind of things. I think at the end of the day, it's important to know that the journalist needs you as the expert, as the thought leader, as the subject matter expert, or as the spokesperson, right? And you need them as well. So it's a two-way relationship at the end of the day. And really breathe, you've got it. Just remember that you know, it's an interview. It's like skiing. I say to clients, like, it gets easier. The more time on the hill, the better you get. So the more interviews under your belt, the better that you're going to get. So it's really similar to skiing in that way.
Greg, does it get easier?
Yeah, some people don't know this. I had a like almost petrifying fear of public speaking of any kind for a long time. So yeah, it's gotten easier. I'm pretty comfortable here today.
Great. Glad that we're not putting you through a very horrible experience this morning. Mininder, I want to talk to you too about risk. I remember at a fairly recent TIE Vancouver event, you had an investor guest on who mentioned he didn't provide any details about a company he'd invested in. He said, you know, and I'm not going to talk about it because I don't want other investors piggybacking onto my investment and diluting my investment. And so, you know, as a reporter in the room, like, oh, I really want to know what that company is, but he didn't say anything. And I, to this day, still have no idea what that company is. Risk. Do you want founders to keep certain things in mind when they're speaking to reporters from an investor perspective?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would recommend a couple of things. And I'm speaking globally. In Canada, a lot of things are, you know, reporters are usually friendly, not hostile in Canada, at least to touch wood, to my experience. But if if somebody's about to interview you, check what they've done in the past. Are they likely to be supportive? Do they provide balanced perspective? Or have they done a hatchet job in the past? I'm sorry, Haley, people in your business do have that, some of them. So you need to know what kind of reporter this is. And also about the risk as to where you are in your stage. If you are in the process of raising money, if you don't need to talk to the media, don't do it till it's done. Because any bad, this is not a bad news for a week, this could affect you. And, you know, I actually do a speaker event with investors and founders who've raised. And one of the things we wait is I check with the founder, say, okay, is money in the bank? Okay, now we interview you. Not while you're communicating, because we don't want to be the cause of anything, because audience asks questions. And sometimes founders, well, you're like, let's wait till money's in the bank, then we can talk about the raise. And same thing for investors. You know, I was trying to book somebody who was on CFO of something going public, and they did a mega IPO. I think it was a 15 billion. Yeah, Greg, that's one of the healthcare companies. I won't name any names, you guys guess. And we waited to host the event after the IPO was done. So you need to know, is this worth it? And so at some stages, you need media coverage, go for it. Some stages it's neutral, good. And when you're going through critical things, you need to know if this goes wrong, what impact it could have on your business and you. And in that case, just wait a couple of weeks and then do the media interview.
And I think you need to know when you've got quiet periods, right? When you're actually not legally able to speak. So things like that as you're growing and scaling or pre-IPO are really important to be aware of.
Yeah, Greg, well, you very recently went through this. What can you tell us about how it's different now in terms of how available you are, what you communicate, what you think through before making a public statement?
Yeah, I mean, there's elements that have carried through the whole thing for me that are almost rules of engagement. For me, it's like, be honest. It sounds simple, but some people, and it's about being careful and researched about your honesty too, right? Like, don't quote stats that you're not totally sure of, you know, do the research, be kind. And I mean that not just to the journalists, but also to anyone you're referring to. This is a personal thing, but I don't find it ever benefits to even say trash talk a competitor. I'd say focus on your story where you can, right? Even if you get pulled into a conversation about others in the market or other things, it's like try and bring the focus back to the part that you know best. Don't go too far into stick to what you know. There is the temptation. I got quoted once in an article on real estate, and I'm no real estate expert, but someone asked a question, I gave a thought. I said, I'm not an expert, but here's what I think. And then, I think if you qualify it, that can be an okay thing, but like you shared, you're always on the record. And so I'm no expert will get taken out of the quote, and then you'll be there as an expert on a thing. So be careful what you're quoting on. Be really careful about predictions. This is something I was always conscious of before, but now I'm sort of legally required in different ways, but be very careful. And that was to your point too, around, you know, pre-IPO or pre-fundraise. And we've seen lots of companies say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do this. those can get great coverage if they're great stories, but then if you don't deliver or you don't deliver on time, it can actually turn into a future negative potential thing. So I'd be careful about predictive elements and wait until the story is actually happening or breaking before you're really speaking to it. And then post IPO, the big things that have changed for me is we have public disclosure documentation. So I can talk to that. I can talk to what's in it. I can't talk to anything else, especially future looking things. And so have to be very careful about any elements of predicting the future, where we're going. Whereas in the past, we did to some extent say, over the next year, we're expecting to do this or that, where we were confident. Now I can do a lot less of that. So that's changed a little bit on that front.
Interesting. Kathleen, obviously this doesn't apply to, say, a company in Greg's position where there are legal requirements and financial requirements around it, but in other situations, what do you think about embargoed news releases or pitches? Maybe you can explain what that is and when it might serve a good purpose.
Sure. I think so. Embargoed as a term, it's when you're going to put a news release on the wire, you're going to do mass distribution, maybe with pitching, and you're sending it to a few members of the media under embargo. So you're giving them the information maybe a day or 2 days in advance and saying that the embargo lifts at a certain time. So let's say you're going to put out a news release tomorrow morning, the embargo will lift at 8 a.m. Eastern time. And you might be giving the information today. It allows journalists to get their ducks in a row to start the story. So you've got some earned coverage right when the story breaks on the wire or through mass distribution. It also allows your spokesperson a bit of wiggle room, right? So you can do interviews the day before, you can kind of warm up, and then you can do interviews day of when you put out on the news release as well. So it can work as a really nice tool. We tend to use embargoes always when we're looking at an earned media strategy. And we'll also use exclusives sometimes, right? And some members of the media only operate on exclusives. So for example, The Logic, a technology and policy publication, they primarily work on exclusive. So you have to give them exclusive for something. And an exclusive when you're giving one member of the media like the first rights to the story is a good way to think about it. So they get to break the story. And this can be huge when you do need to have a groundbreaking, longer form piece of content to then help your media strategy. So I think embargoes are great. They work. You need to know when the embargo lifts, you need to make sure you bold that information, put it on your news release if it's attached as well. So it's on every single thing. Know that embargoed information could be forwarded, right? So you've got to make sure if they're forwarding that everyone's aware of the embargo. And for exclusives as well, think about that. So those would be my takeaways there. I think super useful when you're looking at using them for your strategy.
Are there scenarios, Minder, where you as an investor might speak to media on behalf of a company you've invested in?
Based on good corporate governance principles, I would say no, never. So the only person speaking on behalf of a company should be the CEO. And there's only one time when a board chair steps in when there has been some public issue involving the CEO. That's the only time. So only the CEO should speak. But the stage that I spend most of my time, early seed stage, is the wild, wild west. So everything goes. I've seen a bit of everything. But if you are an investor, a minority shareholder, you should keep your opinions to internal forums within the business and let the CEO handle it. And if you don't like what's going on, there are other ways goes around it. But I personally think we should keep our opinions to ourselves and just don't write them another check if you don't like what's going on.
I would say there are times though when you can leverage quotes from board chairs or from investors in your news releases, and you can really leverage them as validators, particularly if you're looking to grow your board or raise further capital. So I think for quotes as validators, they can be a great tool. And I've seen it where you'll have the CEO as spokesperson, and then you'll have a secondary spokesperson jump in, and it may be one of the investors, and that can work really well. Or if you have a really credible investor and you're in that stage where you are growing and scaling and you might not have the brand recognition, but your investor does, it's a great way you can leverage their brand to help push your story out there. So I would say I say there's no cookie cutter approach to media relations because it's so case by case, right? It's like, where's your company? What stage are you at? It's hard to give generalized advice on this topic.
Absolutely, Kathleen. But in that case, I will wait for the CEO to refer me as a source before I will speak to the media.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Makes sense. So we have another question here from our audience. What is the best way to get PR for a bootstrap startup? Getting exposure and putting yourself out there is one of the biggest challenges startups face. Great question from Eric. Kathleen, maybe you can share, first of all, some details on what it might be like to work with a company like Switchboard and whether there are opportunities to do so if you are really a startup that's trying to rub two pennies together and figure everything out, including media and marketing.
I think at the startup, I mean, Switchboard, I mean, we've been a startup, right? We're 5 years old. So I know kind of what that journey is like in the early stages. Now we do work with larger companies. So more kind of in the growing and scaling stage, or that have IPO'd. So lots of different clients. We always will help startups. So we actually have an email at startup@switchboardpr.com. And we do a series with Vancouver where we profile startups because we know it's really hard for you to get the coverage. So if you want to email that, someone on my team will get back to you and you'll get a nice little feature piece in Vancouver. But I think things to think about when you're bootstrapping and time and budget are tricky. I think the things you want to think about are building those relationships yourself, because you can do it. And it just takes the time and the investment. And where can these stories go? What can you speak at? Speaking events are a great way to do it. Where can you look for low-hanging fruit wins? And by no means does this mean that the publication isn't as great as the Globe and Mail or TechCrunch, but where could you maybe do some podcasts for speaking events? Where could you go to build your brand and your company? So you look for those low-hanging fruit wins. Good ways to do this are if you've got a competitor or you've got someone who has something similar to you as a startup, going to their press page, looking at their founders' Twitter feed as well. Where have they appeared? Where could you appear? All of those things can be really helpful. And I would say, think about the resources that you have in your community for counsel. So for example, the BC Tech Association has really great programming for startups. I know Ray at Launch has great programming for startups. So leverage what you can, because there is so much in the ecosystem. There's awards. So New Ventures BC, for example, the awards that they run, right? Those can be really helpful. Any way you can do that and just build your community, I think, at the early stages. I know from an event that I spoke at Launch, I met someone who's a startup who's now a growing and scaling company to watch, who's kind of on the up next unicorn list, right? So you look at those things and you think there's such a connected community in Vancouver and BC as a whole that if you can leverage that, I think great relationships can be made.
Greg, you already shared some great advice on this topic, but anything that Thinkific did in the early days or post early days when we started being more intentional in your strategy that might be helpful to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and a few things is the lines are really blurred here now on what is media, and it's not just Business in Vancouver and Globe and Mail and TechCrunch and things, right? There is the podcast, and even Business in Vancouver has podcasts. So the lines are very blurred in that you have so many more potential outlets, so much more local, but actually so many more smaller publications online that might not be local. So I'd say do it all. Don't overlook local. Don't obsess over, I have to be in this publication. You take lots of opportunities. And that is something we did in the early days, especially when you got into, say, podcast or YouTube interviews. I'd say, we talked about featuring customers. I think 1-800-GOT-JUNK did an interesting strategy early days of helping their customers get featured in their customers' local media. And so that was an easy way for them to get a mention and really tell the story the way they wanted to, but through the eyes of the customer, and get the customer coverage as well. So that was an interesting approach. And they got a lot of local coverage all over the place that way. Another one is that if you're struggling to get an interview, interview them. And so this doesn't work with everyone, right? You may not get to interview someone at Business in Vancouver, but maybe you can. But I did this early days where I was pitching or sending out things and wanted to get on a podcast or chat with an influencer of a kind. And so we started just interviewing them for our YouTube channel. And dirty little secret, early on, our YouTube channel had nothing. So it was like, I want to interview you. And of course they said, yeah, I'd love to be interviewed for your audience. And we had no audience yet, but now it's paid off for them as well, because we've gotten coverage. But I found actually reaching out and interviewing some people in some of those blurred line scenarios got me onto podcasts or the reciprocal, but just do a good job of it, right? Don't interview 20 people poorly, interview 1 or 2 people and research it really well, impress them with your interview skills and your research of them, make them look good. And then they're going to want to do the same for you.
That's a really great tip. And to the point about leveraging local media, I mean, if you graduated from a local high school and you went to a different elementary school, or you're a volunteer in another community, like you can use that. You can say such a graduate is now doing this and approach, all the communities you possibly could. And I find generally local newspapers are a bit more starved for assistants and stories, and they're highly understaffed, and so looking for great local success stories to highlight. Maninder, your thoughts on what a bootstrap startup can do to get coverage?
Oh, yes. I think eventually, as we look at it, everything lives online. So if you were in the Globe and Mail, yeah, you know, maybe some people read it when they get the newspaper one day, but it will live online forever. So as Greg said, you could have your own YouTube channel where you decide what the message is. And honestly, using good SEO strategy, that will show up before your Globe and Mail coverage. So why is Globe and Mail coverage better than the YouTube? I don't think it is. So as a so where media, for example, Haley, you're covering startup, what it does is it provides credibility, that a reporter has looked at it and they found it to be credible. And that's the only difference between a startup saying this is true and media coverage saying this is what it is. So I would say as a bootstrap, start your pick based on your customers, either LinkedIn posts, do posts, start a blog, do a YouTube, but take charge of telling your own story on your own terms and at your own time. And then, you know what? Haley would see it and say, hey, this is interesting. Let's give them some official coverage. But don't wait for a reporter to connect with you to start telling a story.
Yeah, and the qualifier is important, whether, you know, a prominent investor has invested in the company or they've been featured in another publication. It helps the reporter figure out, you know, is this just someone who has a great idea and they haven't done anything, or is something serious happening here? We have only a few minutes left, but I don't want to leave quite yet. Maybe we can leave on a note. Again, there's been so much advice and great tips shared, but final thoughts from each of you for the entrepreneurs and founders in the audience, something that they can maybe consider doing today if they want to get more media coverage. Maninder, back to you.
Oh, I would say media coverage is like fire. You can use it to cook food. You can use it to warm your house, but out of control, it will burn it down. So keep an eye on, is it helping your business? I know, sorry to be a Debbie Downer, but is it helping you build a business, or is it just stroking your ego? If it's ego stroking, focus on building a business.
Well said, and thank you so much for joining our panel today. Kathleen, over to you, a final piece of advice or recommendation.
I would say leverage target objective message. I think being intentional in any of your communications, whether it's for the media, whether you're communicating with your customers, with investors, what's your target, what's your objective, what are your messages? And then I remind clients all the time, have your golden nugget ready. So if you're in an elevator, whether it's your pitch or you're talking to media, what is your 30-second, hey, this is my why, this is my company, and be excited about it and practice, practice, practice. The more you're delivering that, the better you'll get.
Practice is key. Practice in front of a mirror. I've done that as a reporter too, asking questions, and the same is true if you're going to be answering questions. And Greg, final words to you, any advice or recommendations?
I definitely echo Maninder and Kathleen's comments. And then I'd say assuming those are true and you really want to make a focus on this, as I would say, start small and work up as opposed to shooting for the top, which is what a lot of people do, especially if you're early at it, is, you know, it can be really, a lot of podcasts are starved for guests. And so you just start there. And then the nice thing is you get that practice piece too, right? So start small. That's what I did. Got on way too many podcasts, like 100 podcasts in a few months, and then worked the way up from there. But it made me a lot more practiced at the interviews and start to see some results. And then you can leverage that up a stage, up a stage, up a stage.
Perfect. Greg, Kathleen, Maninder, thank you again for joining us for this very informative discussion. Kathleen, what was that email again that people can take advantage of?
So startup@switchboardpr.com.
Perfect. And if you want to pitch BIV, news@biv.com as well. You can send all your pitches there. Thank you to the three of you. A pleasure speaking with you, and really thankful that you could participate in Vancouver Startup Week.
Thank you, guys. Thanks,
Thank you. You too. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. What a great session. Thank you, Business in Vancouver, to our speakers, Haley, Maninder, Greg, and Kathleen. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining our session today.